And this was the time when the revolution of the bankers took place, led by the parliamentarian for the New World Order, Roger Douglas, and also his mate Richard Prebble. And we know that interest rates were reaching 25% in New Zealand at that time, and completely paralysing all the productive sector. And also we know that the banks were promoting this through the media, through the Reserve Bank, which is privately owned, and also the International Monetary Fund.
And I think that that was, in my mind, how we should have kept on developing. I think we made the wrong analysis. We were certainly fed the wrong analysis. All the time we were told that it was the market which should allow enterprise to flourish, and that only by rugged enterprise, individual competition, could New Zealand prosper. And we were always told that countries like Japan and Germany were the models, and of course that is rubbish.
We can have, as Frank Holmes put it, an efficient economy, but one which must fundamentally be socially just, because we reject entirely the idea of some rampant efficiency which does not take heed of those social priorities which ought to be part of the New Zealand tradition.
The need for economic change and the cause of social progress was acknowledged. And although the means may not have been what most people expected, it's now clear some people, at any rate, were aware of what Roger Douglas wanted to do. Even the trade union movement had been let in on the secret.
Roger Douglas had indicated quite clearly in a private sort of, if you like, outline to the FOL in February of 1984, his economic program, which was exactly what subsequently emerged. That program in February identified the GST, the movement to flat tax, the corporatisation, privatisation agenda, the 20% devaluation. When we confronted David Lange and Geoffrey Palmer, they disavowed any support or knowledge of this, said it was a fabrication. When we objected to that, they said, well, it's a misunderstanding, and we were requested to destroy all copies of this document.
And what you're saying is that the plot, the secret agenda, as some other people call it, was fully formed by the beginning of 1984, long before the election.
Long before the election, and the tragedy is that the union movement knew about it, and the union movement accepted the assurances of people like David Lange and Geoffrey Palmer that it wasn't their agenda.
The illusion continued. Spending on social welfare increased. A free-for-all wage round in 1985 saw increases of 17% in the private sector and 25% in the public sector. It seemed like a painless restructuring, but sweeping reforms were already underway that would give a lie to that notion. The government had warned that everybody would have to take their share of the hard bits, and by 1986, one sector at least was already feeling the pain. In his first budget in '84, Douglas had wiped away subsidies to farmers. Federated farmers had been pushing Muldoon to do it for years, but they hadn't bargained on being the first target.
Good evening. Over the next hour we'll be looking in detail at aspects of the Douglas budget, how it affects the economy as a whole, as well as the more immediate measures which affect us personally.
We did not expect to be treated so harshly so soon in relation to other sectors. I'm concerned about the effect that it will have on the confidence out there.
Over the next 2 years, the combination of increasing interest rates and a collapse in prices would put many farmers under severe pressure. After more than 30 years farming, Dan and Jill Dufty lost everything: their car, farm machinery, and their stock.
Yeah, we're down and out at the moment, but we're not dying. We're fighting, and we're going to fight every inch of the way. They're not going to ruin our livelihood and our future.
In frustration, a most unlikely protest marched on Wellington. Farmers, for years supporters of the status quo, were on the warpath. The years ahead would see even more distress in rural New Zealand.
Agriculture suffered first, and the truth was that the farm subsidies were the easiest to dismantle. So our protest was not that he'd done it, because we'd asked for it, but that he hadn't done it to anyone else. And we said, in effect, to government, do unto others as you've done to us. And they didn't for far too long.
Sure, maybe farmers were ahead of some other groups in facing change, but not a lot. And in a way, farmers were quite helpful in ensuring that other change came about, because once they realised that the government was not going to go back to subsidies and tax breaks and the like, they became, in some ways, our best supporters, because they were out there saying, we want fairness, we want the ports reform, we want railways reform, we want government reform. From my perspective, that was great.
They were the ones who had the immediate means of rectifying what our fundamental economic problem was. The pain came to be shared. It came to be shared in huge measure by many thousands of New Zealanders.
There would be discord over public service restructuring, but the country found unity in a cause which turns the new Prime Minister into anti-nuclear hero. New Zealand's first independent stance on foreign policy had been launched by the third Labour government. Our anti-nuclear position was to take us into choppy waters. As the first wave of deregulation rolled on, grassroots support for the protest movement grew. The new government's anti-nuclear policy sustained the illusion of a party with a united vision. Public attention was diverted as New Zealand became an anti-nuclear hero and bought itself a row with the big boys. At stake was New Zealand's 40-year defence alliance with the United States. Since World War II, we'd gone hand in hand with Washington on foreign policy. The formal expression of the alliance was ANZUS. The new Labour government's anti-nuclear policy flew in the face of the Pentagon defence chiefs. But a confident US expected New Zealand would come to its senses.
It was clear that there was going to be an anti-nuclear policy, and it was clear it was going to be a strong policy. But it wasn't clear that the Americans wouldn't be able to get a ship in.
There were people in the party who, I think knowingly, not just in ignorance, but knowingly fudged that issue. They knew what the cost would be. They also knew that at that stage, New Zealanders probably wouldn't pay the cost.
I was opposed to nuclear weaponry, and I wasn't opposed to nuclear-propelled warships. Not open slather. I mean, there should be controls.
The Monday after the election, the US Secretary of State George Shultz flew in to talk Turkey with David Lange.
There will be a continuing association and dialogue, and we value that.
Not willing to commit himself up front to a nuclear ship ban, Lange manages to buy 6 months' grace from Shultz. A compromise is suggested to permit a nuclear-capable but not necessarily nuclear-armed US vessel to visit. An old US frigate, the Buchanan, is nominated as a test case. But when the party gets to hear about it, it won't buy the compromise on any terms. The Prime Minister is on a visit to the Tokalaus when the party executive meets and threatens to withdraw support from the government if there is any easing in the anti-nuclear policy.
The timing of the request was bizarre. It was designed not by my colleagues to pull the rug from under me, but by the Americans to pull the rug from under me. I was actually in the middle of the Pacific, wallowing around in a chartered tramp steamer on its last trip before it went to the knackers, and you couldn't get proper communications. And we kept steaming towards Pango Pango, and I got to Wellington, I got to Pango Pango, went on board, read the papers, and said, that's not on. I had no contact with Wellington at all. I landed at Wellington, I went to the parliamentary building, and I went from the basement to the 9th floor and got out in the cabinet room. And I was there to say that visit's not on. And the mythology of the period is absolutely prolific. Helen Clark got me, Jim Anderson got me, all these people got me, and the truth was that my driver got me. And I went and did it.
If the ship is nuclear capable, then it won't come, unless we can be assured it does not carry nuclear armaments. Your question, do we have the means to establish that? My answer, no. QED, no, come.
The mouse has roared, and Washington doesn't like it.
We deeply regret the decision by the New Zealand government to deny port access to our ships. We consider New Zealand a friend. It's our deepest hope that New Zealand will restore the traditional cooperation that has existed between our two countries.
I remember in the Woolston Working Men's Club, a lot of the people who fought in the Second World War said, what are the Americans saying this for? After all, they'd come into war, they're always late, we're always in there before they are. Well, how dare they speak to us about this?
Margaret Thatcher sends an envoy to make veiled threats about New Zealand trade to Europe if we don't sort things out.
So, when the British Foreign Secretary arrived in Wellington, the government and its officials were prepared for the hard word on butter and for a linkage between butter and the upcoming passage of the nuclear-free legislation, which Britain says means the Royal Navy will no longer be able to visit here. Sir Geoffrey Howe did not disappoint them.
But the task will be even harder so long as New Zealand maintains its present defence policy.
But the Americans hadn't finished with Lange. The Dirty Tricks Department got to work. Veiled and not so veiled threats began to surface.
The extraordinary man, the Deputy Secretary of the Navy, made a speech in Honolulu once which said that I should be eliminated. It might be necessary to eliminate me. That didn't make me feel particularly good. As I was in my office one day, the man who's now in defence, Gerald Hensley, came to me and said, we've had a warning of a battery of missiles heading across the Soviet Union towards the United States, and we'll know within 20 minutes whether there is a detonation. And I sat there in my office and I didn't quite know what to do. One wonders about that, so I called in my principal private secretary and we talked about it, and I decided that there was nothing one could do. I decided to, the funny thing was I decided not to say goodbye to my family. I always remember that. Do I have the right to capitalise on insider knowledge? It's like buying a share, isn't it? And I decided I should shut up. And I sat there in some trepidation because it seemed to me that that was the ultimate cataclysmic event if that had happened. And later Gerald said that it didn't happen. Well, of course it didn't happen. So he's quite right. He hasn't told a lie. And there wasn't a battery of missiles heading towards the Soviet Union. The answers which I got later were that they had confused geese on a screen. My own view is that it was not even geese on a screen. It was designed to unnerve me.
The dirty tricks didn't work. David Lange was now bathing in the attention of the world's media. New Zealand's anti-nuclear stance results in an invitation from the Oxford Union to debate the issue. Other Western leaders and our own diplomats are appalled at the idea.
Margaret Thatcher sent a note through her High Commissioner, which he delivered to me, asking me not to do it. And that sealed it as far as I was concerned. I told him what I thought of him and of his new hair dye and various other things like that. And I decided definitely to go. And we settled the terms of the debate. It was one of those interesting occasions when foreign affairs were put on the test. And I went to the UK without any foreign affairs official. It's the only time a Prime Minister has ever travelled out of New Zealand
Was that because they disapproved of your taking the invitation?
Completely. Yeah.
They tried to talk you out of it too?
They did.
And the House on both sides is rising to him. That is a very, very rare event in the Oxford Union. I'm not sure in the 25 years since I was president I've ever seen that happen.
It was unbelievably fraught with danger and yet had such potential for advantage. And I was attracted to it, and yet I realised what it could mean.
What could it mean?
I'd have been dog tucker if I'd blown that.
The pressures from the big powers had provided a David and Goliath analogy for the world media to play with, and our David played the metaphor to the hilt.
We are, in fact, to be made an example of. We are to be ostracised. We are to be convicted of some form of heresy and put on probation. We are going to be kept there until we are compelled to resume our seat in the dress circle of the nuclear theatre.
And that's the question with which we would like an answer, sir.
And I'm going to give it to you if you hold your breath, just for a moment. I can smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
The one thing the Americans never forgave me for was that interjection. And that was deemed by them to have been a terrible slight on the relationship. And it says something for my inability to understand what American sensitivities are about.
There was pride when Lange won a standing ovation at the Oxford Union. There was outrage when another nuclear power committed the first act of international terrorism ever experienced in New Zealand.
The former 400-ton fishing trawler Rainbow Warrior looked a tragic sight today as it lay tilted against Marsden Wharf after being rocked by two separate explosions.
The bombing of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour by French agents stunned the nation.
The Rainbow Warrior was a gift. It was a very unfortunate and tragic gift, but to him it was an opportunity to actually take that whole anti-nuclear crusade a long way further than it probably could have, even with the constant bombardment by the United States.
The Rainbow Warrior was the defining moment for me, because I knew that was the end of any New Zealand commitment to the so-called Western Alliance. It was not when it was sunk that I knew, it was when we knew who'd sunk it that I knew. I often write about the period, and I do so with wistfulness rather than triumph. It is a period which was absolutely significant in New Zealand's history. It was a period which was calling out for the government we had in 1984-7, and it was a chance to have a long-term government of calculated intelligence, where the social richness of New Zealand could have been enhanced because of its economic wealth, and where the obsession for money overran any form of political, social, human sense.
So let's have a look now at John Key and how he began his life as a foreign exchange dealer. And this all happened way back in the 1980s under the David Lange and Roger Douglas government, when they allowed the international bankers to come into New Zealand and virtually take over the country on the finance side.
Making decisions at a very fast, instantaneous decisions.
Are you aware you're talking about millions, sometimes billions of dollars? Is it real money to you?
Yes, it is actually. I think so, yes.
15:30?
No, 17.
So how good at his job is John Key?
He's exceptional. He is one of the best that I've seen in my 12 years within the markets.
And what makes him good?
John has an uncanny ability to know when to hold positions, when to cut positions.
Can you say this year how many days you would have lost money?
I'd prefer not to really, but it's relatively low.
Why not?
It's probably prudent not to.
Most dealers are happy if they lose money only one day in every 5. Close-Up understands John Key has failed to show a profit only one day this year.
He seems to have a sixth sense with respect to where the market is about to move to. We're not talking about in a matter of 5 minutes or a matter of an hour or a matter of 5 days. We're talking about in the next 5 seconds. That John seems to be able to read what is going on in the markets by what he's hearing through the broker boxes, through the other competitors ringing through asking for prices, or us ringing the other competitors. He just seems to know just a little bit quicker than most people exactly what's going to happen next.
So what do you do to look after him?
We certainly pay him adequately.
And the reason that John Key was able to be so successful as a foreign currency dealer was not because he was psychic, but because he was inside trading with Andrew Kreiger from the Bankers Trust in New York, which is controlled by the Jewish international bankers, particularly the Rothschilds. And he was using derivatives, which means that he was taking $100,000 and turning that into $30 or $40 million. And that enabled him to make large purchases of the New Zealand currency, which was only a small currency. And so he'd buy at a low price, and he pushed the market down with John Key to around about 5%. And we know that then he was able to make millions of dollars by reselling it. And so this is how it was done way back in 1987 while he was working for Elders. And then in 1988 he went and worked for the Bankers Trust in Auckland. And then later on he moved to Sydney to work for Merrill Lynch, which is the trading arm of the Bank of America. Then he went to Singapore and also to London, where he headed up the derivatives section there. And then he was able to go to America and end up owning shares in the Bank of America.